Thank you. Just recording for the people who couldn't come tonight, and if it's all right with you, I just thought I'd like to welcome you all here. This is the first Charles F. Doran lecture on Canada and international relations. Two topics that were the center of one of the great careers of an American studying Canada, I think, in all of human history.
Wow, that's a long stretch. Even older than me.
Professor Doran was my advisor for my master's degree and my PhD, and was the man who put me in charge of the Center for Canadian Studies. And he held responsibility for our Center for Canadian Studies, founded in 1969 by Robert Mundell and Bella Balassa, to be a focus for Canada here in Washington and at the university. He was our first American-born director and our longest serving director. I could say 40 years, but that might make people think you're older than you are. He started as a child prodigy.
Try 47. 47.
But it was a remarkable career. The job I have and Canada's place here at the university really is thanks to him. So this lecture is the first of many, but there's no better way to start something than by going to the man himself. Just one little note, if you're taking notes or telling your friends about this after, it is not the Charles F. Doran Memorial Lecture. It's still with us. Let me turn the podium over.
Well, it is a delight to be here, to see friends and former students, and also in general people who are interested in Canada and Canada-US relations. It's just the way that I measure success for the institution. And I know the Dean has generously given the Canadian Studies Center enough administrative space for it to flourish. And under Chris Sands, I know it's going to flourish. So we really appreciate that. Now, I have to tell you, I have, of course, a deep and abiding love for Canada, but I also have two other fields. One is called conflict analysis, and the other one is international relations, particularly international relations theory. And in some quarters, I'm much better known there than I am on Canada. So I am going to warn you that I'm going to borrow from those fields and look at a single question here about Canada, namely, what is the explanation for this strange tension or stress that we're feeling between Canada and the United States today? What's the real basis of that? I'm going to start off by giving you three familiar interpretations, which I think you'll find in much of the historical work and so on and on Canada. And I think those are not very compelling, at least with regard to the explanation of the situation today. So what are these three? Well, very quickly, and then I'm going to turn to the one, obviously, that I prefer and am promoting. The first I might call the conflicting personality hypothesis. But in fact, historians would call it the great man theory of history, or the Carlylean interpretation of history, in which the argument is that there are people both, in this case, on both sides of the border, at the head of the governments who don't get along with each other. And that this really is a source of great tension and problems. Now, it probably is the case that Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau didn't always get along perfectly and smoothly. But if you look at Justin Trudeau and Biden, I don't think there was any tension and problems personally. And yet, there were certainly difficulties on the horizon. In addition to that, I think today, if you look at Trump and Carney, I mean, they get along magnificently well. I just sat through a session at the Council of Foreign Relations, and it was on the record, so I'm able to say something about it. those two men understood each other and had known each other for a very long time and got along really well. And yet, the problems exist. Now, a second possible interpretation is the so-called ideological conflict or political party opposition argument. And that is that, you know, for things to go smoothly in Canada-US relations, you have to have Republicans and conservative party people in power, or liberals and Democrats in power, or maybe the New Democratic Party, but you have to respect this ideological difference that exists internal to the countries and then somehow spills over. And in fact, it even goes so far as to say that it's kind of self-regulating. The Canadian public is very sensitive to this, and oftentimes there have been elections where there's been a party shift. Some people think that that was because they were trying to sort of adjust and minimize tension. The problem with that is that there have been many times when there have been differences in terms of party ideology across the border, and that those differences did not amount to any difficulties. And other times you had similarities on both sides, and there were still problems. I mean, let me give you an example here. I trust that you follow the history of Canada and US relations enough so that this is not, these names aren't unknown. Diefenbaker was a prairie populist. Did not get along very well with Kennedy, and of course, eventually Pearson came in, replaced Diefenbaker, and Kennedy and Pearson got along wonderfully. The two parties were in a line: Liberal Party, Democratic Party. It seems like this resolution. But then a little bit later, Lyndon Johnson came in. And that was another issue. That didn't go as smoothly, even though the Democratic Party and the Liberal Party were there. So this thesis is so simple and clear and intuitive, and I think it's not very compelling. So what about the third one? Well, the third one is sometimes called the insurmountable foreign policy issue thesis, where there are certain problems that are just so difficult that the best minds in Ottawa and Washington simply can't wrestle them down and solve the problems. What are some of the names? Well, softwood lumber. How about that? That's a familiar. That's as North American as you can get, but also oil exports and production. So I have to tell you, it's so amazing to me. Americans were unhappy about the fact that Canada at one point thought it might cut off oil supply to the United States under one of the liberal parties, because I don't know, they were using it for some kind of leverage or something in negotiations. So Americans were really worried about that, and they talked about previous treaty agreements and so on. On the other hand, then there's a situation where the oil comes in and there's too much of it, or it's the wrong kind. And again, there's a complaint on one side or the other, particularly I think on the US side. Well, this is not going to govern the entire relationship. And the two governments are sophisticated enough so they can smooth those things over and get around them. So I think there are no insurmountable issues that are so problematic that they offset other things for the overall relationship. Well, okay, if that's all true, and even if it isn't true, let's look at the approach that I'm going to suggest. What I'm going to suggest is this, that world events impinge on both Canada and the United States. Oftentimes in similar ways, not surprisingly. Each country, we're talking about two sovereign, independent countries with their own interests. But if you're as close as we are to one another, there's a lot of common interests. So we're affected the same kind of ways. The situation here is that the United States and Canada are really, I think, sensitive to some of the same stresses and pressures in the international system that make it difficult for coordination of policy. Now, I'm going to draw upon something that I call power cycle theory, which is international relations kinds of analysis, and very quickly point out that the argument is that the great powers go through cycles of power. I shouldn't say cycles because only one that has ever repeated the cycle. These are very broad cycles of history in terms of what are we measuring of relative power. And so the argument here is that there are certain points on these cycles where the probability of major war is much higher than at other times. Now, I've got a device here which I'm supposed to be able to use, but that's maybe not true. Is anything happening there?
Yep, you got it. It's very small, but you have it.
Boy, I tell you, it's invisible as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, it's way up there.
Forget it. These are the points, A, B, C, and D. What are they? That's the lower turning point, first inflection point, upper turning point, and the second inflection point. What are these? Well, it's not just a question of countries peaking in relative power. It's a question of going through these inflection points on either side. What happens there? Well, if you study Galileo at all, you know this. We're talking about acceleration and deceleration. And those points, we've looked at all the countries and all the major wars between 1815 and the present, because we have banks of all this stuff now on computers. And there's a very strong statistical relationship between passage through one of these critical points and major war. Why is that? Because at these points, everything changes. And by the way, inflection points are just as problematic as the upper turning point or the lower turning point. Now, very quickly, what is the system we're talking about? Well, in the 19th century, it was Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. Between 1945, and we can actually talk about years, the cut points are that precise here. Between 1945 and 1990, there were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, there are probably six great powers. That's our view, which would be United States, China, what I would call the European complex of Germany, France, and Britain, Japan, and who am I forgetting here?
India.
I didn't mention Russia. Well, Russia is certainly part of it still, hasn't dropped out by any means. And then the last one, interesting one, is India coming up outside the central system, the outskirts of the system, coming up very fast. It's growing faster than China is. And historically, this is a very important part of the relationship, because what happens is that small state on the outside comes up and takes power share away from the leading states to the top. And that's exactly what's happening today in the international system. India is taking power share away from China. And I trust that each side knows that that's the case. Now, so what happens then? We've got difficulties at these points. What do we have today? We have a situation in which two great powers are experiencing this. You've got Russia at the bottom of the central system, trying for the third time to go through the cycle, for very peculiar historical reasons. I think this time it's met its match. I mean, I just don't think it's going to be able to rise on the cycle. And so at the bottom then of that system, at that point, the probability of war is much higher. And what the evidence is obvious about that. But Putin is my friend Zbig Brzezinski put it this way, I think best. He really, I thought it was well done. He said, Russia has two choices. It can either be an empire or it can be a democracy. Well, we know what it's chosen currently. And so that creates problems for others. But what about the second one? China. China has just gone through its first inflection point. There's a big debate recently about whether it had actually peaked And the answer is it has not. It's very evident that the economists all clamored and said that against those who got this confused, said that it wasn't, it hadn't peaked, China hadn't peaked, and I agree with them. China has gone through this first inflection point. That means they're slowing down, and they know they're slowing down in relative power terms, even though they cover it very well in terms of discussions. So that creates further problems. And when you have two states like that doing that, that spills over on the rest of the actors in the system, as it currently is doing. Now, there's a further thing I have to mention about power. And if you want me to talk at some point about the US case, I can do that, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It is interesting. Well, I might as well say this much so that it's clear where we're coming from. The United States has been in relative decline in overall power terms since 1970. So is the Soviet Union and the United States. Who recognized this? People who had never used a computer, didn't know anything about data, but were brilliant in the sense of understanding power politics and history, namely Henry Kissinger and Nixon. They were the ones. Kissinger said in the 1970s, early 1970s, that we have peaked. The two big actors have peaked. But of course, what happened was that Russia was pushing so hard that it exhausted itself, and in 1990 it collapsed. The United States has declined slowly, a little bit, but because it started from such a high point, that decline is not overwhelming. And as you look at the data, as you look at the statistics, because we have data on this situation. Now, there's one more thing that has to be remembered, however, about this discussion of power and how it affects a conflict and how it then in turn affects Canada and the United States and their relations. And that is that China is actualizing its military capability to a very high degree, an astonishingly high degree. That seemingly has not been felt or understood by a lot of analysts, but I think it should be front and center. Historically, there were two other countries that went through that kind of experience. Nazi Germany was on the second, at the second inflection point on the declining side of the curve. It was declining in 1935 in relative power terms. But it had actualized its military capability to a very high degree. As Churchill, who followed these things very closely as a journalist then, said, I have wonderful pieces in which he analyzed it just right. Nazi Germany then was attempting to actualize and did actualize its power. For example, it produced more gunpowder in 1935 than all of its rivals combined. Does that mean it was the most powerful actor in the system? Absolutely not. It meant that it actualized the military capability when others were not. Soviet Union, same thing. In between 1970s and the 1980s, Soviet Union spent twice the percent of its GDP relative to the United States, twice as much on military acquisition, military development, and so on. And it was able to equal the United States in a lot of areas by doing that, but at an enormous cost to itself and to its economy. Now, what does that mean then currently? It means that the system has got to respond to the situation. And in my estimation, it's not doing very well at so perceiving this. You know, after 1990, we Americans talked about being the unipolar state and so on. Yeah, the data show that there was that kind of a little fluctuation, but it wasn't enormous and it didn't last very long. Everybody else, including people in the United States, wanted a peace dividend. So they all cut back their militaries. And meanwhile, you had China coming along and growing fast. even though it was slowing down in its relative power, but it was still growing very fast. And it actualizes its military power so high. Now, what does that then mean for us? What it means for us is that people are attempting to think about how to counter this, which is a struggle. And the effort is made difficult because the liberal trade order, and I'm the greatest defender of the liberal trade order, I trumpeted it everywhere. I was a great defender of NAFTA, for example. Actually did consulting work on it because I so strongly believed in it for both countries. I still do think NAFTA and NAFTA Plus are great things. And I will then tell you openly that the liberal trade order is the best system for everybody in the system, particularly smaller states and developing countries. But the problem is that the liberal trade order has hollowed out the industrial capacity of a lot of countries, particularly the United States. So we're the most powerful country, but our industrial capacity is really, really minimal because we do wonderful things in high tech, we do wonderful things in services, in agriculture, but we haven't kept up in terms of the industrial base. So now when we want to, so what's happening is that China can build ships far, far faster than we can. So this administration has come along and looking at this clearly has said, well, we've got a solution. The solution is to abandon the liberal trade order because we think we have a substitute which will be better for us than it will be for our principal rival that we're having to deal with. And of course, what was the substitute was something called tariff or transaction-based economics. Now, I can say this because it was on the record. Mr. Carney said openly to Americans in New York, he said, well, we like the liberal trade order. And he's right. It was great for Canada. It was great for the United States. But it did have that consequence we have to deal with. Now, what is Trump trying to do then? What he's trying to do is to use tariffs to induce investment to come into the United States, foreign investment, and keep American investment here, and to rebuild this base. Well, what is the likelihood that that is going to work? I can't prognosticate. I don't know. I think it's going to be very, very tough, very difficult. It's very difficult. I'm not going to go into this now, but I will if you prompt me later in the question and answer. Canada is an interesting case because Canada under Pierre Elliott Trudeau had an experiment in which it tried to use protection to induce greater prosperity and development in Canada, and particularly to reduce American foreign investment, and at the same time attract other investment into Canada. That was a failure, absolute failure. Now, why is that? It's an absolute failure because the goods that were produced were too expensive, because the Canadian economy is small, it's too expensive, and the quality of the goods was inferior. I'm thinking about Massey Ferguson tractors. Have you ever, did anybody here know anything about that? Remember those? You just couldn't sell them in the United States. So that didn't work. Now, if that's the model, then for this effort at protectionism, that's not very encouraging. That's quite worrisome. On the other hand, and I guess maybe I will perhaps conclude here. On the other hand, if a man by the name of Kurt Campbell, who Americans know, was Deputy Secretary of State under Biden, and that meant that he had the responsibilities for Asia, did an article with a man by the name of Doshi in the recent Foreign Affairs with one piquant sentence. I'll bet they debated this, whether they're going to include it or not, but they did, in which he said, by 2030, China will have twice the Navy, twice the size of the Navy of the United States, unless something changes. Now, something could change. We hope it will change. But if it doesn't, that is going to be the situation. Now, the problem is that while the United States is exploring this and trying to do these kinds of things, it spills over on near neighbors. It spills over especially in Canada. The one thing that is saving the Canada-US relationship, in my judgment, in economic and trade terms, is NAFTA plus. There's a debate as to how much of the trade is actually covered by that. I don't know. I saw statistics all the way from 60% to 90%. I don't know what the percentage is, but that is important. That agreement is crucial. But on the outside of that, there are serious issues, serious problems. Okay, that's where I'm going to leave this at this point and open it up for discussion. But before I do that, I'm going to add a postscript. Have to permit me one bit more time here. I'm still within my limits of 40 minutes. And this postscript is this. Whatever happens in Canada-US relations, whatever governments do, and they struggle and they try to work things through, and it's obviously complicated and difficult. Whatever happens, what is, for me, the heart of the Canada-US relationship is people. People who move across the border, who do business back and forth, who go to school in both places, and who, in fact, insist that that openness exists. And there are good economic reasons why it should remain open in that way. So what I guess I would say is, whatever happens in the future, I would hope that both governments would respect the preferences of the people. Canadians want to be Canadian, Americans want to be American. But they don't mind going back and forth across the border for any kind of purpose and need and reason. And that is important to the prosperity and the success of each economy and of each society. This openness, this the sharing of democratic values, that's an extraordinary thing for North America. And so I guess sounds like a prayer. I hope and I trust that the two governments will understand that what the people themselves want in terms of this crucial, wonderful relationship. Thank you very much.
Don't need to do Q&A for this, man. You know how to run a class better than I do, but if you want to call on people, if you have a question, just raise your hand. And I don't have a microphone, so you'll just have to speak up and maybe chuck it as a quiet question. You'll repeat it before you answer, please.
Oh, do I have that? Go ahead.
Well, if you're running a class, is this going to be on the final exam? Just want to make sure. Well, so I'm glad you mentioned here Elliott Trudeau and how he tried to be more autarkic and it failed. This leads to something that happened this morning, and I'm very happy that Professor Sands has his students, they dealt with the issues, they knew what they were talking about when I asked them. But the issue is, they didn't know what I was taught by the other professors about what was known as a third option, and which keeps getting bandied about recently by the federal government and all over the Canadian national forums and so on. Basically, a third option is that we were going to reduce our dependence on the US and go elsewhere, Europe, Japan, and so on. That failed miserably. What you said about Pierre Trudeau failing is along with those lines, that we are joined at the hip, which then leads to the other issue is that I think it's a foregone conclusion. Canada cannot cut off itself from the US and go to Europe and hoping for to substitute completely. But my concern, which is about running the class, is that first of all, shouldn't the future leaders and decision makers know about something like the third option in our classes? So I was taught very well by a team, and you all educated me, and I'll be forever grateful for that. But I'm concerned that today's the students in Canada and Canadian studies, they didn't know, the Canadians didn't know of the third option and its failure.
Okay, thank you. I think that's more of a comment than it is a question.
What's your response to that?
There is a question. I mean, there is. I'll try to answer it, but it's an interesting thing for you to develop and point this out, especially on the Canadian side. Other questions, comments? They're all welcome. Yes, way in the back.
This is Doran. I'm Peter.
The voice is a little soft, so can you please?
I'm Peter, a recent graduate from SAIS, also from Canada. And the question I want to ask is, how do we strike a balance between strategic necessity and open free trade? For example, you said that the protectionist strategy that Trudeau did ultimately failed, but do you still think that it's necessary for us to develop some of our nascent industry? So currently, for example, the big debate in Ottawa is whether we should drop EV tariffs in exchange for China dropping tariffs on canola products in which we sent them. But without those protectionist measures, Chinese EV cars will come rolling in the country. They'll be priced at about even half of the price of Canadian products, and the hauling of the industry will continue to exist. So between, again, strategic necessity for some of these critical industries or strategic emerging industries as what China identifies, and also by benefiting Canadian consumers with the best products in the world, the lowest price ones, the high cost effective options, how do we strike a balance as a nation?
Well, what you do, first of all, is what we do at SAIS. You combine economics and economic analysis and discussion with political and military strategic considerations. You have an overall sort of view, and ultimately the trade-offs you're talking about are trade-offs. They're policy choices which governments are going to have to decide for themselves in various transactional relationships, how this will proceed. This is a period of great uncertainty. And so there's no experience that we can point to, I think, with regard to tariffs that will be enlightening to us in a positive way. There was some exaggeration with regard to the negative aspects of tariffs. Historically, people would argue, when I was in college, they argued that the tariffs in the 1930s caused the Great Depression. Well, the economic historians have straightened that out for us. It didn't cause the recession or the depression. The depression was caused by other things, but the tariffs made it very difficult to recover from the recession. Or the depression. So that is certain. But this, you see, what is different about this period is that we are looking at where the 80 years of the liberal trade order has left us in terms of our industrial capability. And from an purely economic perspective, it doesn't matter. I mean, what you do, you specialize in what you do best. And you import the rest and you're way ahead. There's nothing wrong with that logic, except when you combine the economic side with the strategic side, and you can see what happens with your defense capability when you can no longer build naval capability, or you can't build it fast enough. That's the situation that we're in today. And the struggle to try to overcome that, to escape that, spills over on friends as well as rivals. And that creates some of the difficulties. And it is my explanation for why there are really strong tensions between Canada and the United States today, which most of us would never believe would have taken place, would have happened. And it's, I think, at this point, not likely that people are gonna say, well, the tariff situation is not a good approach. We're gonna go back to the liberal trade order. That would be a stretch. That would be very difficult to do. I think it's the case that the tariff approach has to be combined with something else. It's really a national policy. You gotta have a national policy. You have to decide you're gonna build certain industrial base. And if the economy is as large as the US economy, there's some chance that you can do that. If you in fact prime the pump to some extent, and get the industries going, and then you have some hope that other industries will, or other firms will come in, and that American firms will stay here and so on. But that's all hypothetical at this point. That's not proven.
I guess I'd like to follow up on that question slash,
And please speak loudly.
I'd like to follow up on that
Yes.
line of thinking then. What measures other than protectionist ones would be effective, do you reckon, in constructing such a policy that would achieve the aims mentioned?
You didn't hear me offer any, did you? That's because I don't have any to offer. At this point, there are two. There are basically two policies. I'm sorry, am I supposed to be using that?
No, it was for the audience, maybe.
Oh, for the audience, that'd be good, yeah. I don't think there are any quick and easy solutions. That's why it's serious. This is a period, this is a transformation actually of the international system. And it's complicated because people can't grasp the fact that China, for example, is slowing down in its growth and at the same time getting more powerful in overall relative power terms. While at the same time, it is actualizing its military potential to an extraordinarily high degree with a purpose anybody can guess. You don't have to guess. Xi Jinping said the military should be ready by 2027. He said Taiwan is Chinese. He's right. It is, according to the agreements that we signed, it is Chinese. But we also signed in the agreement that force would not be used to take over the government, nor would it be encircled with some kind of embargo. That was not part of the discussion, part of the agreement. But Taiwan is at the heart of this. And then in addition to that, of course, is the whole of the South China Sea, because there's something called the 9 dotted line, which was taken over from the nationalists, which covers most of the South China Sea. And that is clearly a Chinese objective too. So they're big time difficult. I could go into this in so much more detail, but I don't want to bore you and I don't want to do that. But there are lots of other issues and problems associated with this that will come back to hurt us in North America, unless we can find a way out of this set of problems. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed your choice of topic to start us off. You know, why do Canadians and Americans not see eye to eye on everything? In fact, as a Canadian who lives in the US and has for most of his life, we have to keep reminding our American friends that it's not a compliment when they say to the Canadians, you're just like us. But my serious point is I'd like to know.
Even 75% of it is true.
I didn't put that qualification. So I'd like to nominate a fifth reason why we may see the world different and hear your opinion. When I was at SAIS, and I think long after that, we had another explanation for this relationship, and sometimes it went by the name of, if you sleep with an elephant, you're going to get crushed when they roll over. We had another version of this: if the U.S. catches a cold, you get pneumonia. You've heard both of those, I'm sure, and that's simply saying that the scale is the explanation for why we don't have the same interests. What do you think about that?
I think that the fact that we share whatever it is, 4,000-mile border with each other. That it has been a peaceful one since the early, well, since 1812. The war that somebody won, we're not quite sure who won it. So that has been such an important aspect of our relationship. In addition to that, Paul Martin Sr., shows how far back I go, mentioned in my presence, I was sitting in Hart House at the University of Toronto, this very posh, nice room, and we were having a very pleasant debate. He was invited as a special guest, and he said, you know, we Canadians are border people. And I had never heard that before, never thought about that. And I asked him, he said, well, I know what it means. Of course, his writing was really close to the border as well. What it means is that an overwhelming percentage of Canadians, I think the figure usually is 90%, live within 100 miles of the US border. Now, this is a lot of people. This is a huge market. This has an impact on all of the United States, is hugely positive and very genuine. But it's a reality. And so when you say, well, and I don't say you say this, but when people talk about this cold thing and so on, yeah, but what about when people have good health and they're up and running and they're doing wonderful things? That's also part of that relationship. I guess I'm basically saying, of course, every nation should have as many interactions as it can with others and so on, no doubt about that. But Canada and the United States are always going to be closely coordinating their policies because their interests basically are the same. And Americans should never forget that Canada is a separate, sovereign, independent country, and Canadians are proud of it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't close, intense interactions, I think most of which are positive, but some of which are negative. There's no difficult question in pointing that out. So I don't see any way of changing this. I don't see how you could change the geography.
My name's Michael Boda, and maybe I'll preface my question by saying that I work in Saskatchewan in a very nonpartisan job. So this is not in any way a political question. But I would like to ask a question about something that Donald Trump has asserted in recent months about Canada, and that is that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. And in a way, this question is over 30 years in the making, because I'm recalling in the 1990s that you wrote an article that supported something similar to that in terms of the strategy of the United States owning all the land between Alaska and Florida, and that would be a good strategic move.
Which article are you referring to? I don't remember having said this.
Is it in Foreign Affairs?
You sure that I wrote the article? Anyway, I reject it. So
You reject it.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, what are your views on Donald Trump's assertion? Because in the context of Canada, while we say that people don't support this assertion, and while we say that, there are many people in Canada, it's the minority, but they are supportive of what Trump is saying. So what are your views on that?
yeah, well, let me just say this. That line about Canada becoming part of the United States would sound much, much better if it came from a Canadian mouth than from an American mouth. And I think that surely there have been polls now to see what people think about that in Canada. I don't know what those polls say, but I predict that what they will say is the vast majority of Canadians are very happy being Canadians. They've got a great government. They've got their problems, but they have learned to deal with them. And as have we on our side, and we have a kind of relationship which is prospered in my estimation, for a very long time. And you know, first of all, this whole thing is crazy because the first people who would complain about a situation in which Canada became part of the United States, let's say there was a great plebiscite and they voted on it and Canada voted in favor of it. First people to complain would be the Republicans, because Canadians are left of the American electorate by a standard deviation, and they'd all end up voting for the Democrats. So you wouldn't have any Republicans elected at all. Now, I respect Mr. Trump for a lot of things, his bargaining skills and so on, not his vanity, but his bargaining skills and his toughness. But I don't think he knew anything about the attitudes of Canadians toward these matters. And I don't think he was also very serious about it.
I'm a Canadian lawyer licensed in New York. I have a practical reason why it should not happen as a lawyer. No, don't worry, I'm not going to sue you. The reason is that each country has 13 judges at the highest court, at the Supreme Court. Law is so complex that they cannot do. In fact, the US Supreme Court does not deal with state matters. It's only pure federal matters. And this was an exam question in the New York bar. It's so difficult. Can you imagine if you add 10 more jurisdictions and 3 territories? Like even the Canadian Supreme Court, they're already overwhelmed by how complex the law is. And that's just Canada. So it's a practical matter. It cannot happen.
Okay, well,
and can you imagine the US conquering the world? It won't, you know?
That's good. That's more knowledge about law than I've ever had. So I appreciate it.
It cannot happen as a practical matter. Because yeah.
Yes, please.
Professor Doran, my name is Alex Wright, and I was actually a student years ago in your world order class. So this is a trip down memory lane with power cycle theory. I want to add in, this is a structural look at nation states. I'd like to talk a little bit and add in a little bit of human behavior and psychology to it, and then ask you, it can be argued the US is at a second inflection point. We are trying to arrest our demise as a great power. My question is, adding in the human behavior not part of this, and what it takes for the populace to understand the issues of China, the concerns around other powers in the world rising in relative power. If you were advising government leaders, politicians, so on and so forth, regardless of party, what would you say to them about some of the best ways to get Americans, as you mentioned, they don't understand, to get Americans to understand some of what is happening with the world order and America's place in it, with its structural power and its where we are in the world. So I was just curious how you would add in that human element and what you would advise our leaders.
I thought when you said human element, you were going to talk about expectations. There's a very distinguished professor at Columbia University who did a review of one of my books. And he said, oh, this was fine, but you don't talk about expectations foreign policy. Now, I actually, can we move this ahead to the next slide? I want to show that that's not true. The best way to get somebody to do something is for somebody else to provide a challenge. They challenged me, I made an effort to respond. It's here someplace. I'm not quite sure. Keep talking. What I'm going to show you is this, that at these critical points, there's a huge impact on expectations about future foreign policy role. And that impact at these critical points is negative, is problematic. It's hugely problematic. And I can show you with these simple graphs. Oh, here we are. With these simple graphs, I can show you what is involved here. The line drawn tangent to this curve represents future foreign policy expectations. There are reasons why it's straight. Forecasting uses straight lines for very good reason. So over time, you move up the curve. This line keeps going up and up and up. And the torque, the twist in this, you can see, is going in that direction. Until you get to the first inflection point. And then something astonishing happens. The direction of this torque completely moves in the opposite direction. What does that mean? It means that there's been a discontinuity, a break in expectations. Everything you expected in those wonderful projections of sorts that econometricians and so on do, everything that you expected for 40 years suddenly is proven wrong. That's a shock. That's a great shock. And that's the kind of thing that China, for example, is going through now. Because their view is, I think, that they'd like to be number one. They think they have the capability. They think they have the right to be number one. That's even more important. But to go through this kind of experience and suddenly discover that your whole future foreign policy outlook was wrong, that's hard to take. That's very hard to accept. So that's one example of how human involvement is involved, and I think expectations are very, very important. They're shared by entire societies, and particularly promoted by governments. So I don't know if it gets to.
It does. One quick follow-up then.
Yeah.
Do you think that leaders can influence the populace's ability to pull together, or do you think we need an external shock to the system that makes our survival or our power an existential crisis?
Well, that's a very dangerous question. I'm sure you're aware of it.
Yes.
What I guess I would say is this. It is certainly the case that when, for example, democracies together face a common opponent, and that opponent threatens them all, there's a coalition effect or coalescing effect among them. So the tensions that we see here between the United States and Canada, there are going to be a lot of other democracies as well, because tariffs are not pleasant. Those are really problematic, but I think we don't want that test. We don't want that to be the explanation for why we're able to overcome our differences. All right, that's where I would leave it.
Thank you.
Just following up on that theme, because you touched on a question I was thinking there. You hadn't spoken about groups or clubs or international organizations just yet, but so in your estimation, nowadays, vis-a-vis the United States and Canada, how relevant is the G7? Canada is hosting the G7 this year, NATO for that matter, and then also facing then competition or a threat from China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that they're building. How do you see this playing out?
I'm sure you follow this very closely. There's a lot of finagling that goes on. And the Americans have been finagling it for Canada in that particular organization. That's why we suddenly have the 20. And it's a different metric because these big developing countries were coming up and exceeding the size of the GDP of Canada. You know, our bias is we want Canada in there, but we don't want to look like we're fiddling the cards. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah.
At the Mark Kearney talk at the Council on Foreign Relations, if that was the UNGA one, you know, he talked about Canada as a middle power and its importance as a middle power. But, you know, you obviously just said Canada's presence in the G7 and a lot of these international organizations has been kind of dwindling. You know, with that in mind and America's plans to push against China and other kind of growing economies, do you see a future of USMCA or NAFTA Plus, as you call it? Trump last week in the Oval said that he could see it be a trilateral or bilateral, he doesn't care. So what do you, if you were advising government, what would you say in regards to kind of this new trade order that we're moving into?
Well, I think I made my preferences clear. Canada can be very thankful for the people who put together the NAFTA arrangement. And the United States has to observe the benefits and so on of that situation. On the other hand, there seem to be a lot of trade-offs here, and when you start talking about tariffs, where are you gonna use them and so on, it's tough to maintain those kinds of relationships. So if I were Canada, I would focus on making sure that that arrangement remains in place. Now, what else can be done? That's open to speculation at this point. It's just uncertain territory.
I'm curious though, and I apologize if you covered some of this at the very beginning, but as we're looking now to the future of USMCA, we're seeing Mexico, for example, is agreeing to apply their bound tariffs, right? And essentially they're coming in and they're saying, yes, we're going to align with the US policies in regards to upping our tariffs on China, right? We're almost in a way going to take the China Section 301 strategy and make it our own, because Trump has been giving them a lot of pushback, but we haven't heard much from Canada in this regard. And so, of course, there's that question, right? How is Canada going to position themselves? Because obviously, if they want to maintain a lot of the benefits that they got from USMCA and their tariff policies are not aligned with the United States and Mexico, it would seem they would be at risk. And if I might add just a second question to that, when we look at the United States vis-a-vis, for example, the European Union, even under the prior Biden administration, there had been a number of discussions about how the United States and the European Union could work together to circumvent some of this hollowing out concerns, although the Europeans also were a bit wishy-washy on it as well. But where's Canada in this, and what are their views, and what's the future?
Everybody, as your question nicely illustrates in its detail, everybody is uncertain about where they're going in terms of these tariff kinds of relationships. Everything is based on bargaining. The bigger actors presumably have an advantage in the bargaining, but what happens when two big actors themselves disagree? Then you have problems. So I think I would best say that this is uncertain ground, and we just have to see how this thing works out. I will admit that Mexico responded in a different way than Canada did. So we'll see how that works out. These are two very different relationships with very different problems. And so, but I trust that the North Americans are going to be able to sort through this. And for me, as I look at this, I would say NAFTA Plus is a very important institution, especially for Canada and Mexico.
But just to add to that, it is really interesting if you look at trade trends, if you look at how US-Canada trade has changed vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis Canada's trade, say, with China, or Mexico's trade with China, if you go from sector to sector,
Well,
it's a bit uneven, right? I mean,
there's certain
trade
things
has
people can learn from this very clearly. One of the things that you don't want to get, if you're Canada or Mexico, you don't want to get in a situation where you're transiting goods from abroad and trying to come in under the NAFTA cover. That is no, don't do it. And that's the source of a great deal of grievance on this side. Then on other issues, we just have to do the best we can. There's no perfection, but I'm confident. How about that? I'm confident that Canada and the United States will get through this difficult kind of period. I just like to see Mr. Trump and Mr. Carney playing poker opposite each other. That would be an interesting game to observe. I think it would be a friendly game because they respect each other very much. Go ahead, Richard.
Richard Lavoie, Old Spice alum. Thank you for the fine presentation. Regarding US-Canada relations, could you speak more to the opportunity of foreign direct investment that would be beneficial perhaps for both countries while addressing some of the concerns of the US?
Well, I would like to believe that there are enormous opportunities. I do. I believe in our economy. I believe in the free trade system, so I I think that there are great opportunities. One of the things that is promising is that the US economy is as big as it is. It's a huge, huge economy. And so it's an attractive place to invest, especially if you have encouragement to do that. Encouragement means the governments smile at you and help you a little bit. So there's some hope for that. And there are a lot of experiments going on about that. But in a way, this is oriented more toward American companies who are encouraged to invest here rather than someplace else. But then there come into play all the questions about the labor force and whether the labor force is sufficient and well enough trained, and whether visas are to be handed out or not handed out. Just a whole host of issues that complicate what otherwise might seem straightforward. You say, you got this huge American economy, the American government is smiling on you, invest there, take advantage of this. But then what happens? You say, yeah, but it's one of the great democracies in the world. And 3 years from now, the Democrats might be in, and they might throw it all out. So that's, if you're a businessman, that's the kind of thing you think about. And there could be no guarantees there that there's going to be continuity. My own judgment is there may be more, in American foreign policy, there's more continuity than there is change, discontinuity. So I think a lot of what's there is going to remain. But if you're a businessman and you're spending a lot of money, you want to have more assurance than that. And this is not a political climate where that insurance can be guaranteed. Yeah.
My question was about your opinion on the world order. So we were at the event this morning together with the commander of the Canadian Army who said we are moving towards a lead, not support initiative. We see that
I didn't understand that.
The commander spoke about changing policies within the Canadian military to where they would now lead instead of support.
Oh, yeah.
They also, we can also see similar trends happening in the European Union. We talk about the rules-based order, which is very institutionalized, but it is backed by American military forces to the extent that we've earned a nickname of being the world police.
But what is your question?
My question is, do you see, as we are at the inflection point, do you see that changing? Should Washington change, or do you think that's going to be imposed on us as powers around the world, around us, change themselves?
Well, I guess we have to spend a little more time talking about these graphs and so on, because I'm not quite sure how that applies. By the way, it was a great presentation this morning. Some of you were there. I think you'll agree with me. It was wonderful. Let me just indicate to you how much things have changed on the military side. 5, 7, 8 years ago, you had a host of countries who thumbed their noses at the notion that NATO members should spend 2% of their GDP on security. Now, admittedly, most of the response has been because of the Russian-Ukraine war. That's where the concern really is, especially for the Europeans. I'm not sure about Canada. But I have to say that the real issues, I would argue, for us, Canadians and Americans, in the next, say, a decade or two, likely to come from the Asian side, not the European side. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why there's such an urgency to try to resolve these two wars so that we can focus on other problems. So we'll see. We'll see what happens in the Middle East. We'll see what happens with regard to Russia and Ukraine. But an end to that war sooner would be better than later in terms of the overall efforts to try to deal with the global problems that are really serious, that are really impending on us from the Asian side. Let's see, you've had two shots, so I'll go here. Did you ask a question before?
No.
No, okay.
Okay, so allow me to bring in another piece in here. So Canada, of course, we know has the longest coastline in the Arctic. And then with climate change happening, this could potentially open sea routes for Canada. And it's, of course, the Arctic is becoming a new space for geopolitical competition. You have near Arctic states like China coming in, India as an observer and so on. Who do you think is going to need the other more? Is Canada going to need the US more, or is the US going to need Canada more? Especially that Canada has the kind of the
Guess what? Guess what?
the upper hand.
Each one needs the other. Indispensable, absolutely indispensable, indispensable, the Arctic. You're exactly correct that this is something that for North Americans is primary. China has said that it is a near Arctic country. Now, I have to admire the Chinese propagandists. They are the very best. They are superb. And what does near Arctic mean? Nobody knows what it means. But what it means is that they're gonna wanna go through Canadian waters. They're gonna wanna take Arctic fish stocks from Canada that are in Canadian waters. They're gonna wanna probably establish bases and other things because they say it's territory that's territory null, and we used to say it's open, and so they should have a shot at it. And they probably will make very strong arguments on behalf of this. All of this impinges on Canada and the United States. The problem is this: Canada has a huge territory, most of it in the Arctic or in the north, and its population is relatively small, and its economy is middle-sized. So it's tough. That's tough. It needs help, and of course it needs from the United States. The United States doesn't have as much Arctic territory as Canada does, smaller amount. But in order to defend that section, we have to work with Canada. There's just, even if we didn't want to, we want to, but even if we didn't want to, we would be required to. And of course, we have NORAD and we have other institutions which are really pretty remarkable in the history of such institutions. But that we have to continue to rely on. And meanwhile, global warming marches forward, and that highway is going to open up. It's shorter between Europe and Asia than other routes. Although I remember listening to the commander of the US Coast Guard say, he said, "I don't know which route they're gonna take," he said, "but it's not gonna be the northern route." So he knows something I don't know about the northern route. I suspect that there are shoals, there are storms, there are all kinds of problems that slow down the passage, and so you're not gonna. But much of it is gonna affect Canada directly. And so, yes, we have to coordinate our policies together to be able to defend that area. That's great. And let me just tell you, at the end of World War II, the United States had so many aircraft, well, so many of everything, but so many icebreakers that it gave the Russians some icebreakers. Today, we have almost no icebreakers, especially the most sophisticated ones. And it takes forever to build these things. They're very big, sophisticated vessels. So, and where's Canada in aircraft, in icebreakers, huh? How many does it have? See, that's a gap. That's a huge gap. And I'm on the Council for Relations. I was on the task force to look at the Arctic. And one of the two basic things we said to the US government is build some icebreakers. Takes a long time to do this, and you're gonna need them. Even though, of course, it's counterintuitive. You say, well, if it's melting, why would we need icebreakers? Well, the answer is it's not melting that much, and it'll take a long time to get through that. So we're gonna need the icebreakers. And meanwhile, Russia has a lot of icebreakers, good ones, really has specialized in the north and is really out front on that. This is a follow-up?
Yes. Russia actually has 44 icebreakers, while the US has the US has
That's a very big number. I would, what do they call an icebreaker? Somebody boat that just goes over and breaks some ice? I don't think they have really that many top icebreakers, but they do have some. They have more than we have.
And the US, I think, has only 2 and 1 is operational. But just a follow-up, the United States is actually thinking of building its next naval base, not naval base, sorry, naval base in the Bering Strait, which is very close to the Arctic. So to your point earlier about not wanting, which shows that the US is actually thinking about the Arctic and the.
Well, you know, thinking and doing unfortunately are two different things. That's the problem. So we take your recommendation. Did you want to make a comment or a question?
I've been debating in my own head if this, so going back to the original power cycle theory, my question is going to be, is there a third ascendant inflection point?
Well, that is a very interesting question to reflect on. It forces me to review why the one country that went through the 2 cycles did so. And you'll see that the conditions were very unique and not likely to be repeated. That country was Russia. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, Russia had the largest army in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. You could say the Grand Army of the Republic was probably the biggest, but that was just everybody joining into the French army. Basically, Russia had the biggest army because it had the biggest, it's an agricultural based economy, had the biggest peasantry. The foot soldiers came from the peasantry, so that wasn't surprising that they put that together. But then what happened was, so therefore they peaked in power early on, somewhere around the period of the Napoleonic Wars. But then the other countries in Europe, namely Britain, of course, the Netherlands, eventually France, late century Germany, all industrialized. Russia did not. So that meant that Russia declined in its relative power during all of the 19th century until near the end. And then the finance minister of Russia said, memorably, I think, he said, give us Russians 2 decades of uninterrupted growth, and we will show the world what we can do. Now, the world did not give them uninterrupted growth. It gave them 2 world wars. It gave them a Great Depression. It gave them a government that was as anti-commercial and free enterprise and growth oriented as you could expect, as you could find. And despite all of that, by mid-century, Russia was one of the 2 biggest countries in the world. And that's because it had all of this potential for industrialization, and its population supported that and so on. But what also is true is that it had great problems economically because of the type of government it had, kind of economy it had. The country collapsed in 1990. Mr. Putin says that the worst thing that happened in the history of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I thought, well, what does that mean about World War I and II? They were just incidental, or the Great Depression. But in any case, there is now an effort, obviously, on his part to try to get the country moving again. But when you look at the natural problems that they have, and not the least of which is they only have 143 million people. They have this gargantuan territory to defend, but they only have 143. That's something to think about as we look down the road in the 20th century. Think about what that means for where Russia is going to be after Putin. Okay,
Ladies and gentlemen, I think Professor Doran. Can only offer one critique, and I hope you'll forgive me for it, because I think you've now made it impossible for me to convince anyone else to do the Charles F. Doran lecture, because how are we going to top that? Thank you all for coming. one of the tricks of the trade, especially on a university campus, students, please forgive me, is that we don't emphasize that we have drinks and snacks after, just so that only the true believers who are really interested in coming to the lecture come. But we do have drinks and snacks after. We have a reception. Please come talk to Professor Doran, talk to all of us, keep this conversation going, and we hope you'll come back in.
But where is it?
Oh, just down the hall, right? It's down the hall. It's right out on the terrace if the weather's still nice. So yeah, you'll have a chance to take pictures and take pictures of Professor Doran. So thanks again. This is great.
Yeah, good to see you, man. You got it? Okay, good. So on that memo. And then I'm like, gosh, it bothers me.
Oh.
No.
Like that. I think it's gonna be like.
No, it's back.
I know.
A year and a half ago.
And there's the e-com.
I think on Thursday, my brain.
Went to Urban.
Back meeting.
No, I don't think it's a data vote. I had a Russian unit.
Go back meeting during the SAIS exam time.
Yeah. Interest, and so I'm.
There's like every Tuesday and Wednesday, it's like.
The core of the city is, it was the biggest city in Saskatchewan.
Different course on Russia and the food.
Yeah.
Semester maybe next year.
Just for a second.
I know,